Hi, everyone. I'm going to wait just a quick minute so that we can allow everyone to jump into this virtual space. Welcome. We'll get started in just a bit. So good afternoon from very rainy Philadelphia. I'm Stephanie Schwartz-Bailey. I am the Education Program Manager and Preservation Consultant at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, and I use she, her pronouns. I am really pleased to welcome you here to another feature webinar in the Conservator's Corner series, this one called A Year as Associate Preventive Conservator by Maddie Cooper. In this talk today, Maddie will tell us about the emergence of preventive specialization in the United States. And she's also going to touch on her involvement in projects before and leading up to her appointment at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, where she actually serves a dual role on both the Preservation Services team and the Conservation Lab staff. Before I turn the program over to Maddie, I would like to just quickly remind you that if you would like to type a friendly message at any time to all or any of us, you can go ahead and do so in the chat box. And also, if you have a question for Maddie, go ahead and put that into the chat box, because we'll have some time at the end of her presentation today for Maddie to pull those questions out of the chat box and have a little discussion. Lastly, you can also activate the closed captioning if you'd like to do that by going to the bottom of your screen and hitting the button that has the CC on it to activate that. At the conclusion of the program, a pop-up box is going to appear. I'm taking the surprise away, but this pop-up box is a very short post-program evaluation. Any answers that you can provide in this program evaluation are much appreciated by all of us here at CCAHA, because your feedback helps us develop future sessions, and it also helps us analyze data that helps secure funding for future educational programming. We would especially like to know your thoughts on this Conservator's Corner series. And this is a special series that we started during the pandemic, in which we are trying to share with broad audiences various compelling preservation and conservation projects going on around CCAHA. And in particular, we like to feature the professional journeys of our staff. This program of the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts is provided with generous support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Independence Foundation, and the William Penn Foundation. Thank you to our funders. So now I would like to introduce you to Maddie. Maddie works, as I said, with both the Preservation Services team and the Conservation departments to carry out preservation surveys and assessments for museums, libraries, archives, and community collections, and to complete treatment projects requiring preventive care. Maddie has worked in a wide range of institutional and community collections across the US and holds an MS from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for being here today. I hope you're staying dry, or maybe it's sunny where you are. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation, and Stephanie will stop me if you can't. But hi there, thanks so much for coming out today. It's been a real treat to reflect on my first year at the center in this position. That is, it's a new position to the center, and it's a relatively new professional focus in the United States. Today, I'm going to go through a quick summary of what preventive conservation is and what it means to me particularly. And then I'll talk about one of my projects this year that to me exemplified all the things that I love about the discipline. So this is one definition of preventive conservation that I like. Any measure that prevents damage or reduces the potential for it. It focuses on collections rather than individual objects, non-treatment rather than treatment. And this one's from the Getty Conservation Institute. If you Google what is preventive conservation, definitely a number of different definitions will come up, but I like this one because it's pretty concise. And to me, it also implies the importance of scientific investigation in preventive conservation. So before we prevent or reduce the potential for damage, we need to understand what damage actually is. Can we define the word damage? Is it the yellowing of paper? What's going on in the paper to cause that yellowing? Is it the cracking of wood? Is that a chemical or a mechanical change in the wood that's causing the cracking? Maybe it's both. Damage is often the business of the material-specific treatment conservators who treat it, and the conservation department at the Conservation Center is staffed by paper, book, and photograph conservators and technicians that specialize in the types of damage that plague the materials they treat. Preventive conservation, on the other hand, focuses on the potential. So once we have a definition of damage, can we pinpoint what causes the potential for it? Or in other words, the risk. Is it one of the usual suspects like moisture or heat, or maybe it's a pollutant like sulfur from exhaust on the busy street outside, or acid from a cardboard box that the object is in? Maybe it's a combination of these things. Maybe it's a combination of some, but not all of these things. Finding out what they are and mitigating them is the aspect of preventive conservation that focuses on collection objects themselves. But to me, preventive conservation is more than just the material aspect of collections. And if the Getty definition captures the scientific aspects of understanding damage and potential or risk, this graphic from ECROM captures the social aspects of preventive conservation, because holistic preservation is definitely a team sport, at least in my eyes. And I love this graphic because it highlights the aspects of preventive conservation that are focused not just on the material of the collection objects themselves, but also on the communities that work with and access the collections. We might know that putting collections in a cold, dark room with no pollutants or other harmful materials might minimize the risk of damage to the greatest extent possible, but taking that approach to all collections care completely cuts off the accessibility that should be at the center of our work. What are we preserving these collections for, if not awareness, appreciation, and use by people in the future and the present? This aspect of preventive conservation is exemplified by the Preservation Services Department at CCAHA, which works with collections and communities on surveys and assessments, educational programming, and improving collections environment. I like this part of the graphic that says, instead of trade secrets, think communication. I should say, though, that while the professional focus of preventive conservation is relatively recent, at least in the United States, preventive conservation itself is not new, not even close. In fact, the practice of preventive conservation is as old as the creation of cultural heritage itself. The preservation of stories through written word or oral traditions is a form of preservation. Creating dwellings that respond to the environment, keeping spaces tidy, and gathering manuscripts into libraries are all forms of preventive conservation. I'm sure many of you do preventive conservation in your jobs. And if not there, then you certainly do preventive conservation in your lives. So if preventive conservation is both ubiquitous and centuries old, and both conservators and preservation specialists at the Conservation Center work towards both the material and people-focused aspects of preventive conservation, and what exactly does a preventive conservator do? Well, of course, I can't speak for all preventive conservators, and though preventive conservators are common in places like Europe and Australia, there aren't many of us in the United States. Some have shifted their roles from treatment-focused conservation and training. Others come from a background in collections care. The Winter University of Delaware program in art conservation began offering preventive conservation as a major of study in 2016 after researching the prevalence of the specialty outside of the US and the potential benefit of conservators with a holistic focus. And the program has graduated 4 preventive conservation majors to this point, of which I am grateful to be one. My training at the University of Delaware included the study of environmental conditions and management, building systems, emergency preparedness, mitigation and response, surveys and assessments, monitoring, reporting, and communication. And while conservation treatment is not my focus, it was important to me personally to maintain skills necessary to carry out basic treatments prescribed by a treatment-focused conservator or those required for triage or stabilization of water-damaged collections, because emergency preparedness and response is a particular interest of mine and the focus of my research. I was happy to draw on all of those skills this past year as I worked closely with both the Conservation and Preservation Service departments at CCAHA. My projects took me from DC to Germany and virtually to the Deep South. I was able to work on the treatment and rehousing of a portion of large collection of photographic objects with CCAHA conservators and carry out virtual preservation needs assessments for members of the Historically Black College and University Library Alliance with my preservation services colleagues. But the project I'd like to focus on for the rest of my presentation is a cultural heritage emergency recovery trip that I feel best illustrates the work of a preventive conservator. In June of this year, I was able to co-lead a team of graduate students in a cultural heritage recovery effort in Bad Neuenahr, Ahrweiler, Germany. Ahrweiler is a town in the region of Ahrweiler in West Germany. The region, which was once occupied by the Romans, sits firmly in wine country, bordering the Ahr River Valley and surrounded by the Eifel Mountains. It's incredibly beautiful and incredibly idealistic, as you can see in this photograph on the right. But on July 14th and 15th of 2021, heavy rain caused flooding across Western Europe. Bad Neuenahr, Ahrweiler, was one of the hardest hit communities. More than half of the town's population was affected by the flooding. Many lost homes and possessions, and some lost loved ones in the flood. And while the focus of recovery of Ahrweiler has rightly been on people and homes and infrastructure, cultural heritage was also affected by the disaster. The Ahrweiler Museum lost approximately 80% of its collections in the flooding, and the remaining 20% was salvaged by local first responders and volunteer collections care workers from neighboring cities, including staff and students from the Cologne Institute of Conservation Scientists. These early salvage efforts took place days after the floodwaters receded and focused on rinsing and drying objects and then packaging for storage until they could be reassessed later on. So on May 30th of this year, our team traveled to Ahrweiler to assist the museum's recovery. On the far left of the image on the left is the project co-leader and former resident of the Ahr Valley, Martin Breugner, who's the director of the Winter University of Delaware program in American Material Culture. The 4 graduate students included Emily Bach and Rachel Kane from the Winter University of Delaware program in American Material Culture, and Allison Kelly and Ashley Stanford from the Winter University of Delaware Art Conservation program. We worked closely with Heike Weinskaiser, pictured on the right in a photograph that captures her infectious positive spirit. She's the curator of the museum and has orchestrated the recovery of the collection from the early salvage missions on. Our first step in the recovery effort was to set up our workspace. Heike had arranged for us to work in a temporary office space located behind the museum. Supplies were lended by local conservators and donated via an Amazon wish list by members of the Society of Winterthur Fellows and brought to Germany by the team. Additional support for the project came from the University of Delaware and from the Conservation Center of Art and Historic Artifacts, which donated my time to the project. Our supplies were limited to what we could safely bring from the United States or acquire easily in town. And I should note that the town is still recovering, and so acquiring supplies is pretty difficult. We also didn't know what kind of objects that we'd be working on before arriving on site. So everything we brought was a bit of a guess. On the right, you can see the workspace where we designated areas for supplies, object examination, treatment, photography, and after treatment storage. And on the left, you can see a smattering of the supplies that we used. We also had access to a HEPA filter vacuum, which was really helpful when dealing with potentially hazardous dirt and silt from the floodwaters. And we also had access to isopropyl alcohol, which we ended up using. Though there were a variety of objects requiring treatment, including plaster figures, paintings, and archaeological objects, we decided to focus primarily on a collection of glass and ceramic souvenir objects that represent the rich history of spas in the region. The geographic location of AHRWEILER and the Ahr Valley means that it's a hotspot for mineral water and has been for many years. And so there are spa towns all up and down the Ahr Valley. These objects had been rinsed and packed by responders and volunteers, but they were still caked in a layer of silt and other flood residue that ranged from a thin film to a caked on layer. They were good objects for our team because they were relatively straightforward to treat with the resources that we had available to us. Additionally, there was interest in a nearby museum acquiring a portion of the collection on loan for an upcoming exhibition. Because the majority of the objects had lost their identification numbers in the flooding, we developed a system for assigning project numbers that were attached to objects using paper tags. Any identification numbers predating the flood were also maintained. We also worked together to create a condition, examination, and treatment documentation form. And this was an important step for the group, which allowed us to discuss condition issues as a group and come up with a consensus on a plan for treatment. We walked through the process of assessing and treating the objects with the entire team, which was made up of half conservators and half material culture specialists with no formal conservation training. It was important to walk through the important concepts like solubility testing and written and photographic treatment documentation with the entire team to ensure consistency and safety in our work. In the end, we were able to document and treat around 80 objects, which you can see here in the photograph on the left, including a large number of the glass and ceramic souvenir items, several metal items, and several clothing items. In addition to the treatment, we were able to develop a protocol for object recovery that will be copied by a team of instructors and students from the Cologne Institute of Conservation Sciences this fall when they travel to AHRWEILER and work in the same temporary workspace that we had access to this summer. But probably more impactful than any treatment work that we were able to do was the attention that HICA was able to garner around our work. The project was covered by several local news outlets, and we saw visitors from local residents to the mayor. While 3 small shelves of objects may be a drop in the bucket of the AHRWEILER Museum, HICA has continued to use the attention around the project to garner renewed support and funding for the museum's recovery, which had been fading as public attention began to turn elsewhere. In addition to the treatment of AHRWEILER Museum collection objects, we also held 2 clinics for community members in the area who brought by their flood damaged artifacts and heirlooms for examination and guidance on preservation. Through the clinics, we saw objects ranging from albums of family photographs, to leather baby shoes, to an 18th century book of biblical law, which you can see here pictured on the right. We fielded questions ranging from the care and storage of these treasures to health and safety precautions to reassuring their owners that they were worth saving at all. The clinics were a reminder of the scale of the flooding and the power that the preservation of cultural heritage has to represent the resilience of our communities in the face of disaster. At the end of this project, I found myself reflecting on the ways in which the experience encompassed all that I love about preventive conservation. The understanding of material and deterioration that is ingrained in conservation, and the transparency and incorporation of community that comes with preservation. To me, that's holistic conservation care, and that's preventive conservation. That's what I was lucky enough to spend the last year doing with the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I want to thank you all for coming today. And at this point, I would love to chat if you have any questions about preventive conservation or the recovery trip to AHRWEILER. Please drop something in the chat box or feel free to reach out to me on email and put that in the chat box as well.
Thank you, Maddie. We were clearly on the same wavelength when you offered that you pointed out in one of the infographics, the small cartoon illustrating trade secrets to communication, kind of making that change. And I actually was writing that down as you were saying that. That sticks with me too. I'm glad you shared that. Let's see what's in the chat box. Oh, your email, thank you. Yes. Maybe you wouldn't mind taking questions from anyone in the audience who wants to reach out to you later.
Yeah, anytime.
Great. Well, I actually have a question while folks are giving it another minute to think if there's something they want to ask. So I'm curious, does being a preventive conservator give you a certain perspective or give you empowerment to help communities or institutions with no budgets or low budgets or in a disaster situation better than those who might have very robust budgets and lots of policy and maybe bigger staffs? Can you talk a little bit about the difference between working with those two different kinds of organizations as a preventive conservator?
Sure, I think that's a good question. In terms of working with organizations, collecting institutions, community collections, whoever, those that don't have access to a lot of resources, if they're responding to a disaster, but also just anytime they're interested in preservation in general, I think that is a moment in which I would really lean on my preservation services colleagues who have a lot of experience in policy making and prioritizing different preservation projects and grant writing assistance, and have a really good understanding of what resources are already out there that we can offer to a lot of these organizations. So I think that's a situation where I would lean pretty heavily on the preservation side of preventive conservation. But I think it can also be, especially in an emergency situation, have a deep understanding of materials and deterioration. I think that can be really helpful when you're talking to folks who are dealing with an emergency, who really don't know what their first steps are going to be. You can help them kind of prioritize what they might want to salvage first. You can help them prioritize what they might want to rinse, what they might want to move, what they might want to box, whatever, and just give them, help them prioritize. Because in an emergency, I think there's so much going through your head, it can be really helpful to have someone say, okay, well, your glass and ceramic objects are probably going to be okay. Let's leave them for tomorrow and put them out of our mind. And we'll think about the paper and library objects now, because those are the highest risk.
That makes sense. I am particularly grateful for you doing this webinar today, because being the education program manager, I very often get questions from those who are just beginning in the field or who are emerging professionals. And having this webinar as a resource to share with some of those folks who are newish in the field is really valuable. We appreciate the sneak peek and your perspective. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks.
And
I didn't talk much about how I got into preventive conservation, but I started out doing a bunch of internships and jobs doing conservation treatment. And I actually worked in Miami at a couple institutions there. And the reason that I got into preventive conservation in the first place is because I had done, hours and hours of treatment on this wall painting in a house museum there. And then a hurricane came, and the hurricane caused massive amounts of water damage to that wall painting. And I just saw my hours and hours of work washed away by one disaster, which is on one hand, pretty heartbreaking, but on the other hand, sort of gave me the boost that I needed to start focusing on prevention and preservation.
interesting. It's funny how we all come to the field. Everyone, yeah, that's interesting. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat box, so I think I will say thank you to everyone. Keep your eye out for that evaluation in the next few seconds when we close out the webinar. And I hope to see you again soon, virtually or in person at a CCAHA program. Thanks, everyone.